I sort of floated into this tunnel, and there were other figures that I recognized, and this welcoming, like sun, white sun, and warmth, and like being in liquid mercury. It was like...
Elizabeth Taylor was not a woman who did anything quietly. She loved loudly, grieved loudly, fought loudly, and when she decided she could not stand someone, that fact tended to become known in ways that were difficult to mistake or ignore. She had been famous since she was a child. Genuinely, overwhelmingly famous, the kind of famous that arrives before a person has any framework for understanding it or any tools for managing its effects. And the decades of public life that followed gave her a relationship with her own opinions that was unusually direct. She said what she thought, she felt what she felt without significant editing. And she accumulated, across a career that stretched from National Velvet in 1944 to her final years as one of the most recognizable human beings on Earth, a set of professional and personal relationships that contained as much genuine friction as they did genuine warmth. To understand where the friction came from, you have to understand what kind of person Elizabeth Taylor actually was underneath the legend. She was not simply a beautiful woman who happened to be talented, though she was certainly both of those things. She was also someone with a deep sense of justice that expressed itself in specific and sometimes costly ways. Her advocacy for AIDS research at a moment when the disease was being systematically ignored by the political establishment cost her professionally in ways she was entirely willing to accept. She was loyal to people she loved with a completeness that those people found both sustaining and occasionally overwhelming. And she was someone whose emotional life was lived at a temperature that most people found difficult to match, which meant that the relationships around her, professional and personal alike, tended to be either very warm or very cold, with limited space for the kind of managed, diplomatic neutrality that most people in the film industry learn to maintain as a professional default. What follows is an honest account of 6 people toward whom that temperature ran definitively cold, the reasons behind each situation, the context that shaped it, and what it reveals about the full and complicated human being behind the violet eyes and the legend. Frank Sinatra sits at the beginning of this list, not because the friction between him and Taylor was the most intense on it, but because it captures something essential about the kind of person and the kind of conduct that Taylor found genuinely intolerable. Sinatra was a cultural institution, the chairman of the board, a man whose authority over the entertainment landscape of his era was so total that most people navigated around it as they would navigate around a force of nature, rather than a professional relationship. The court culture that surrounded him, the loyalty politics of the Rat Pack world, the way his approval and disapproval functioned as a kind of social currency in the Hollywood of his peak years, all of it was real, and all of it affected the professional lives of people who moved in his orbit. Taylor did not find this apparatus appealing. She had her own very clear sense of her position in the entertainment world, and that position was not one that required Sinatra's endorsement or benefited from his patronage. More fundamentally, she found his mode of operating, the entourage, the court, the way people reorganized themselves around his moods and his preferences, an expression of exactly the kind of ego that she found both professionally and personally objectionable. Taylor's own ego was formidable, but it expressed itself differently. She demanded respect for what she was and what she had done, rather than organizing the social world around her into a system of tribute. The specific friction between them was documented across multiple professional and social contexts during the years when their worlds most significantly overlapped. Taylor found Sinatra's treatment of women in his professional circle consistently objectionable, a pattern of conduct that those around him accommodated, and that Taylor was not interested in accommodating or pretending she did not see. She was direct about her assessment in ways that the people around Sinatra found remarkable, given his cultural authority, and direct in ways that Sinatra himself found both irritating and, by some accounts, genuinely surprising. He was not accustomed to people of Taylor's profile declining to manage their feelings about him for the sake of professional civility. Her unwillingness to perform that civility produced a mutual wariness that the people who moved through both of their professional worlds noticed and remembered clearly. Taylor did not require Sinatra's goodwill to maintain her position in the industry, and the fact that she did not require it meant she had no practical reason to pretend she felt more warmly toward him than she actually did. That combination, genuine independence from his approval, genuine distaste for his conduct, and no strategic incentive to conceal either, produced exactly the kind of direct, undiplomatically expressed assessment that Sinatra was not used to receiving from people operating at her level. Debbie Reynolds is the most complicated entry on this list because the history between Taylor and Reynolds cannot be reduced to simple antagonism without doing serious injustice to a situation that was genuinely painful for everyone involved and that changed significantly across the decades that followed its most dramatic chapter. The essential facts are well known. Reynolds was married to Eddie Fisher when Taylor and Fisher began an affair in 1958, following the death of Taylor's husband Mike Todd. The affair became public knowledge in a way that generated enormous press coverage and made Taylor, at least temporarily, one of the most publicly vilified women in America. Reynolds and Fisher subsequently divorced, Taylor and Fisher married, and the friendship that had existed between the two women was destroyed in ways that seemed, at the time, irreparable. What is less often acknowledged in the standard telling of the story is the specific way Taylor experienced the years of public condemnation that followed and the specific quality of her feelings about Reynolds during and after that period. Taylor believed, based on accounts from people close to both women at the time, that Reynolds' public presentation of herself as the wronged innocent was more calculated than it appeared, that the performance of devastation that Reynolds offered to the press was shaped at least partly by an awareness of what that performance would do for her public profile at a moment when Taylor's was being systematically damaged. Whether that assessment was entirely fair is genuinely debatable. What is not debatable is that Taylor held it, and that it colored her feelings about Reynolds with a bitterness that the more sympathetic public account of the situation did not fully capture. The two women did eventually arrive, decades later, at something that resembled reconciliation, a détente that people who knew them both described as genuine, if not without residual complexity. Taylor and Reynolds were photographed together in their later years in ways that suggested the worst of the feeling between them had dissipated with time. But the path to that reconciliation ran to a long period of genuine mutual hostility that was considerably more complicated than the simple narrative of wrongdoer and wronged party that the press had established in 1958. Montgomery Clift is another entry that requires careful qualification because the relationship between Taylor and Clift was in many respects one of the great friendships of her life, a deep, mutually sustaining connection between two people who understood each other's specific vulnerabilities in ways that few other people in either of their lives could match. They made A Place in the Sun together in 1931 and Suddenly Last Summer in 1959, and the performances they gave in both films were shaped by a real and visible emotional intimacy that the camera captured and that critics recognized as something unusual. But the friendship coexisted with genuine friction that Taylor found increasingly difficult to manage across the years when Clift's personal struggles became more severe. Clift was dealing with alcoholism and prescription drug dependency that worsened significantly after a near-fatal car accident in 1956, and the effects of those struggles on his professional reliability and his personal availability created a specific kind of pain for Taylor that the people who knew her during those years described as genuine and sustained. She loved Clift with a fierceness and a loyalty that very few people in her life received, and watching him move in the directions he was moving, watching the talent and the person she loved being consumed by circumstances she could not control or reverse, produced in her a grief that coexisted with a frustration that was real, even though she knew it was not entirely fair. The specific tension in their relationship during Clift's worst years involved Taylor's repeated attempts to intervene, to help, to redirect, and Clift's equally repeated resistance to those attempts in ways that she found both heartbreaking and occasionally maddening. Her frustration was not with Clift's struggle, but with his refusal to allow her help, a refusal she understood intellectually and found emotionally impossible to fully accept. People who were close to both of them during those years have described a relationship that was among the most loving in either of their lives and also among the most painful, precisely because the love was real and the capacity to do anything useful with it was so limited. Rock Hudson occupied a specific place in the Hollywood of the 1950s and 1960s, the manufactured ideal of a certain kind of American masculinity, promoted and protected by a studio system that understood the commercial value of the image it had created and the very real danger that the truth behind that image represented to its commercial value. Hudson was gay at a time when that fact, if publicly known, would have ended his career immediately and permanently, and the system around him, his studio, his management, his public relations apparatus, operated as a collective mechanism for ensuring that the truth remained contained. Taylor's friction with Hudson was rooted not in personal animosity toward him, but in her feelings about the system that required him to live the way he lived, and specifically in her response to the studio apparatus that she felt had used and constrained him in ways she found morally objectionable. She was someone who had lived her entire adult life under the management of public image machinery, who understood from the inside what it cost a person to be processed and packaged by an industry that cared about the commercial value of the image rather than the human reality behind it, and her feelings about what the system had done to Hudson were informed by that understanding. The specific friction that developed between them in certain professional contexts was rooted partly in this ideological response to the conditions of Hudson's Hollywood existence, and partly in more straightforward professional dynamics that their overlapping careers generated. But the complexity of Taylor's feelings about Hudson, which included real affection alongside genuine anger at the circumstances that shaped his life, is one of the more revealing examples on this list of the way her emotional responses to people resisted simple categorization. Her later advocacy for AIDS research, which was significantly motivated by Hudson's diagnosis and death in 1985, was in many ways the most honest expression of the full complexity of her feelings about him and about what his situation represented. Peter Lawford is a name that tends to appear in the margins of multiple significant Hollywood stories from the 1950s and 1960s, and his place on this list is rooted in a specific quality that Taylor found genuinely difficult to respect, a quality she encountered in various forms across her professional life, but that she found particularly concentrated and particularly objectionable in Lawford's specific case. Lawford was someone whose primary professional and social identity was built on his proximity to people with more talent, more power, and more genuine significance than he himself possessed. His marriage into the Kennedy family and his membership in the Rat Pack gave him a cultural position that his actual abilities as an actor did not fully justify, and the way he leveraged those connections, the social maneuvering, the name-dropping, the careful positioning of himself as an intermediary between worlds he could access but did not organically belong to, was something Taylor found both transparent and contemptible. Taylor's own position in Hollywood was built on something that could not be borrowed or leveraged from outside sources. She had been famous since childhood, had demonstrated genuine dramatic range across a career that stretched from adolescence into mature stardom, and had survived personal catastrophes that would have ended most people's careers with a resilience that was genuinely earned rather than constructed. Her respect for other people in the industry was largely calibrated against whether their position reflected something similarly earned, and Lawford's mode of accumulating and maintaining his standing did not meet that standard in her assessment. The specific interactions between them across the overlapping contexts of their professional lives were, by accounts from people who knew Taylor during those years, marked by a barely concealed disdain on her part that Lawford found difficult to ignore and impossible to fully address. He did not have the standing in her estimation to demand more consideration than she was extending, and she was not someone who managed her assessments carefully enough to prevent their substance from being visible. Joan Crawford is the final entry on this list, and, by most accounts from people who were present for the more dramatic expressions of it, the most intense and most sustained of the 6 relationships discussed here. Crawford was of an earlier generation than Taylor, had built her career across decades of studio-era filmmaking, and occupied a position in the Hollywood hierarchy that was based on a combination of genuine talent, extraordinary discipline, and a steely professional ambition that had survived circumstances that would have ended most careers. She was, in other words, a formidable figure whose standing demanded acknowledgement regardless of one's personal feelings about her. Taylor's personal feelings about Crawford were not warm, and the reasons for that were both professional and deeply personal. Crawford's public conduct toward Taylor across various shared professional contexts was marked by a condescension that Taylor found both offensive and revealing, the condescension of an older generation of Hollywood star toward a younger one, expressed with a specificity that suggested it was personal rather than simply generational. Crawford made comments about Taylor in industry context that were pointed enough to reach Taylor's ears, and the substance of those comments reflected a view of Taylor as someone whose fame was disproportionate to her discipline and her seriousness as a professional. That assessment landed badly for multiple reasons, not least because Taylor's own sense of her professional seriousness was considerable, and because Crawford's mode of expressing her view was not the kind of direct, honest criticism that Taylor could have respected even while disagreeing with it. It was the kind of comment that circulated rather than confronting, that built a case against someone in the spaces they were not present to defend themselves, and that mode of conduct was precisely what Taylor found most objectionable in professional relationships. She preferred direct hostility to managed contempt, and Crawford's preference for the latter was something she found genuinely difficult to forgive. The dynamic between them became one of the more openly discussed examples of intergenerational Hollywood tension of the 1950s and 1960s, visible enough in industry contexts that the people who observed it needed no particular inside knowledge to recognize its character. Taylor's response to Crawford was not, characteristically, managed or concealed. It was expressed directly enough that the mutual nature of the hostility was not seriously in question. Crawford had spent decades cultivating the image of a disciplined, serious professional whose standards for herself were uncompromising, and Taylor's position, that those standards, real as they were, did not justify the contempt Crawford extended toward others from behind their cover, was one she held firmly and without apology. The two women never resolved the tension between them into anything resembling genuine mutual understanding, and the people who knew both of them during the years when it was most acute understood that resolution was not something either of them was particularly pursuing. Elizabeth Taylor's professional dislikes were, in every case on this list, expressions of the same underlying values that made her professional loyalties so fierce and so sustaining to the people who received them. She found conduct dishonest when it was dishonest. She found exploitation objectionable when it was exploitive. She found the performance of innocence at someone else's expense contemptible when she encountered it. And she found the leveraging of borrowed proximity in place of genuine achievement unworthy of the kind of respect that her own entirely earned position made her particularly equipped to assess. Those are not trivial standards, and they are not the standards of a person who simply collected grievances for the pleasure of carrying them. They are the standards of someone who cared about honesty and about earned standing in a way that made their absence in others a genuine source of frustration rather than a simple social preference. She was not always right in her specific assessments, and the intensity with which she held her positions sometimes produced expressions of those positions that caused real harm to real people. She was not a saint, and she would have found any attempt to describe her as one both inaccurate and deeply unflattering, but she was genuine. And in an industry that produced endless variations on the performance of genuineness without the substance, that quality was rarer and more valuable than it is easy to remember. The people she loved remember being loved completely, and the people she could not stand remember that too, with a clarity that suggests her feelings, whatever their specific object, were always entirely real.